measures on ACT farms through improved riparian management and farm dam restoration, and that's funded through Commonwealth's Future Drought Fund. Just like to start by acknowledging that we're coming to you today from Ngunnawal country in the ACT, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, the Ngunnawal people, and to acknowledge and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge and welcome any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be attending today's event. Some of you may already be aware of the principles of improved farm dam management. The work of ANU Sustainable Farms Research Unit has been working on this for the last few years and have a lot of scientific evidence to support improved management. Likewise, we previously held a farm dam enhancement field day in February this year. And in that event, we highlighted the positive ecological outcomes, the improved water quality benefits and longer water retention during drought in farm dams where dams and the surroundings are well vegetated and protected from livestock. Farm dams are ubiquitous features of our agricultural landscapes, and dams which are functioning well ecologically have the capacity to act more like natural wetlands, which we've mostly lost from our modified landscapes. At the field workshop event, which was held at an enhanced farm dam that had been rehabilitated for about 5 years, we talked about and highlighted the work of our new sustainable farms who've shown that invertebrate diversity and abundance in enhanced farm dams increases dramatically when livestock are excluded from the immediate surroundings of a dam, and when that vegetation surrounding the dam is allowed to develop when compared with unfenced dams. And dams can eventually, in some circumstances, come to resemble natural wetlands in terms of their diversity of aquatic life. This reflects, a very rapid improvement in water quality and habitat quality in the absence of grazing pressure as vegetation grows, particularly around the water margins, which are the most biologically active areas in wetlands. And the establishment of aquatic and fringing vegetation really is the fundamental driver for improved biodiversity in farm dams. Turns out there's yet another benefit to keeping farm dams clean, and that's the subject of today's seminar. Our speaker today is Martino Malerba. Martino has a research background that includes a PhD at James Cook University, developing dynamic models to describe phytoplankton population dynamics under various nitrogen concentrations in aquatic environments. He subsequently completed postdoctoral research positions on ecoevolutionary dynamics of cell size in phytoplankton at Monash University and is now at the Blue Carbon Lab at Deakin University, working on his current project, which is quantifying carbon emissions from freshwater wetlands and exploring strategies for better management of freshwater resources, including farm dams. So without further ado, take it away, Martino.
Thank you very much, Martin. And hi, thanks for having me. I'll go ahead and share my presentation.
Oh, I should just add, this webinar is also being recorded. And if you do have specific questions, please put these questions in the questions function, which you should see a link for in your WebEx browser.
Okay, so I believe you can now see the first slide of my presentation. Right, so it's great to be here, and it's a great opportunity to share my research and what we do in my lab at Deakin University. So before I start, I would like to I wish to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land on which the Deakin Burwood campus is built, and I acknowledge and pay my respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people through Australia, the elders, past, present, and emerging. I also want to thank the organization of this seminar. Thank you, Mary Bonnet, for organizing this event and the whole ACT NRM group, and also thank the funding that made this possible through the Future Job Fund. I also want to thank the Australian Research Council and Deakin University for supporting my research group. Okay, so a quick introduction of the Blue Carbon Lab. That's an academic laboratory based at Deakin University. Is a large group. We have 10 research fellows, 10 HDR students, 7 research assistants, and science communicator. And we have a precise mission in what we do, and that is to do science to mitigate climate change, while also supporting biodiversity, economic growth, and community engagement. And at the same time, we also want to try to have a practical impact on our research, so well beyond just publishing scientific papers. So engagement events like this one, it's what we aim to do more and more to advertise our findings. The Blue Carbon Lab in general has 6 major themes. The first one is wetland carbon. Second one is citizen science, then ecosystem services, environmental restoration, microplastics, and even decommissioning science. I manage the Teal Carbon group within the wetland carbon branch. There are 2 different groups. There's the blue carbon and the teal carbon. The blue carbon is probably a bit more well known because they talk a lot about blue carbon, and it's like carbon associated with marine systems such as mangroves, salt marsh, and seagrass. But then there is also the younger sister of blue carbon, that is teal carbon. Teal carbon is the equivalent except associated with freshwater systems. So everything that you can think of, such as rivers, reservoirs, lakes, ponds, etc. And our research is divided into 3 major themes at the moment. We're expanding, but at the moment we have the farm dams theme, the natural wetlands theme, and the wastewater treatment theme. And the farm dams research is by far the most developed, because we started a long time ago. It was the first project that took off, and it's funded with my ARC research fellow. I'm going to talk mostly about farm dams here. I'm going to touch at the end also about our 2 other programs. All right, so farm dams. Farm dams are small artificial water bodies that are used to collect water for agriculture, mostly livestock and crops. And there are millions of them built across Australia. And although their primary role is to support rural livelihoods, their sheer number means that they have also important roles on the ecosystem around it. And of course, the idea is that farm dams are artificial, meaning that their effect on the environment, they are of anthropogenic nature, meaning that in theory, they shouldn't have been there. And so understanding how humans are changing the environment also means understanding the effects of a farm dam. And these effects are, of course, both positives and negatives. So the key aspect of farm dams is that this word doesn't really tell you much about what you're dealing with, because farm dams come in a very diverse forms and shapes, and there are all kinds of farm dams, really. And some of them look like natural wetlands, almost like billabongs for wildlife. And then all the way to the other side of the spectrum, you instead have something that looks more like a hole in the ground full of mud. So when it comes to understanding their effects on the environment, we also need to include management as part of our analysis, because clearly the different types of management means different types of outcomes. When I first started my research on farm dam, I was quite amazed that when I started looking for statistics, like really basic statistics about farm dams in Australia, there was pretty much absolutely nothing. Even the Australian government, in their official reports, were repeatedly quoting this sentence that there are approximately 2 million farm dams across Australia. I tried to look into this quote, and there was no report of where the results were coming from. I went into the literature looking at how many farm dams there are, and I found all sorts of quotes ranging from Australia, several million farm dams, all the way to Australia, there is 0.5 million farm dams. So, and the overall theme is that none of these quotes I found in the literature had any supporting information. So whatever program we do on farm dams had to start from some kind of spatial database, some initial assessments of how many farm dams there are and where they are, some like really basics. And the way to do so is clearly through satellites, because farm dams are just so scattered across the environment that there would be no other way. But it's not that simple, because developing satellite tools to detect farm dams, it's tricky, because farm dams are small, and so and Australia is large, and so you need to develop new tools that are efficient at detecting farm dams, but whose computational intensive is still manageable when you need to apply it to the entire continent. Right. All right. I should also mention that then after we have this spatial database in place, then we can start to explore key questions about the impact of farm dams on the environment, such as their carbon footprint, their biodiversity value, and their water security. So first of all, spatial database. Stuck. Okay, there we go. Yeah, right. So this is a satellite image of a farm dam. It's a high quality satellite image. And we developed tools. We collaborated with the Western Australia Department of Primary Industry and Regional Development to develop the first satellite tools that could scan through the landscape and identify where farm dams are, then trace the inside of a farm dam as the water surface of a farm dam, understand what is the maximum field area of a farm dam, so trace basically the bare ground around it that is generally submerged during high levels, and then even understand their catchment volume, meaning right, from total field area and water surface, we could calculate the percentage water capacity. That is, we can track fluctuations in water capacity of a farm dam over time. And finally, we can calculate the catchment volume based on data from elevation models. And so understand what type of area is predicted to supply water, rainfall to a farm dam. So this is a snapshot of one of our maps. And so you can have like the different polygons indicate either the catchment area or the surface area or the total field area. Now, the first research we completed at the Blue Carbon Lab as part of the farm dam project is to release the first document with the census of Australian farm dams, how many they are and where they are. And this is the main result, the map of farm dams. We estimate there are around 1.75 million farm dams across Australia. And our estimate has still a little bit of uncertainty because there are areas that are inaccessible even with satellites, and we're still improving them. Together with this, we also developed methods to estimate the water capacity from surface area, so then we could estimate the total water involved in farm dams. Another key property of farm dams, when you start to look at the environmental effects, is the age of creation, meaning that young farm dams have different properties to older, more established farm dams, especially if you think of biodiversity, for example. So this is, again, there were no documentations of farm dam age, and so we had to create a new satellite tools where we could pinpoint on any single farm dam in Australia and then track water content over time. And we could do that. We could do that from 1988 until today. And from this time series, you could then estimate, in some cases, water would start to appear all of a sudden from one year to another, and that would be our cue that there was the year of creation. And from this tool, we could even estimate trends in farm dam accumulation over time for each of the different states and territories in Australia. And that could, again, give us an idea of what is the effect of the accumulation of farm dams on the landscape. Very quickly, we also developed tools to understand water quality, how crystal clear is the water due to like with satellites. Land use, vegetation type, again from satellite maps. Environmental variables at each farmdom, so like fluctuations in temperature, rainfall, etc. And all of these informations are slowly being poured in our portal called housedams.org. It's still at an initial stage, but our idea is to then develop this resource in a way so that anyone could extract data from farmdams. Okay, so now comes possibly the most interesting part of the farmdam research, and that is about the carbon footprint. So what you're seeing here is a footage of a farm dam, and it might look as if it was a rainy day, except it was not a rainy day. It was a perfectly clear sky. What you're seeing here are not raindrops. They are actually methane bubbles. These methane bubbles form at the bottom of most farm dams, and that is due to generally water quality. And then they pop up and they release almost 100% methane in the environment. And so again, here you should try to picture what it means to have, say, we have an estimated cumulative surface area of farm dams of around 5,000 square kilometers, if you put all the small farm dams together. And imagine having 5,000 square kilometers constantly pumping out methane in the same way that you see here. And so this is our question, understanding what it means, trying to quantify it. So the fact that farm dams emit a lot of greenhouse gases was it's quite new science. The first documentation is dates back to 2018 from the Blue Carbon Lab, and that was the first time that anyone internationally found out that farm dams emit more greenhouse gas than what you would expect compared to an equivalent freshwater system. I should introduce here that any freshwater system is known to produce methane. That's perfectly natural. There's basically no way that you can have a freshwater system without some kind of methane emissions. But here the point is that farm dams punch above their weight. So per square meter, farm dams on average emit between 3 and 4 times the equivalent of a freshwater equivalence. And so the question is, why is that? And then how does management has anything to do with their emissions? And that is a tricky question because understanding the effect of management on greenhouse gas emissions from farm dams means that you need to have an experimental design including some kind of causation in it, meaning that you can't just go out and measure a whole bunch of farm dams. You need to have an experimental design where you can select certain properties, and within each property you need to organize some farm dams that are, say, like with no fence, and other farm dams that are instead enhanced or like improved or fenced, and just using this kind of, it's called a block design, where you can then separate the effect of property and the effect of management. Then you can try to infer the effect of fencing or improving the condition of a farm dam on greenhouse gas emissions. And that is a complicated experimental design to organize, but lucky for us, we are now partners with the Sustainable Farms group at Australian National University. And we got together and we started working out how we could answer this question as part of a larger experimental design. So the Sustainable Farms group at Australian National University for like decades has been looking at the effect of farm dams on many ecological properties, and they have developed great science in Australia on all the properties of farm dams and how they interact on the environment. They are mostly interested about biodiversity, so they look at, for example, the effect of farm dams on amphibians, reptiles, birds, etc., and more, and also on productivity. This collaboration was particularly productive because while they were researching the biodiversity impact of farm dams, we were at the same time looking at the carbon footprint. So we were going from farm dam to farm dam together. And while they were looking at biodiversity, we were looking at carbon footprint. So we went across, I don't know, around like, can't remember exactly, around 70 properties measuring farm dams. These properties are scattered between Victoria, New South Wales, and the experimental design consisted in comparing the properties of unmanaged farm dam, so farm dams that received no improvement in their conditions, against the effect of managed farm dams or enhanced farm dams, where there was some management intervention to try to improve their conditions. Enhanced farm dams is well defined in the Sustainable Farms team, and includes several improvements that range from revegetation to organizing limited access to livestock to the water through an alternate access point. It includes full fencing with pumping of water through water troughs, and a series of other aspects that we can discuss more later. So this is us going around and measuring greenhouse gases across these two different types of dams, comparing enhanced and instead open fences. So this is what we found. First of all, in terms of water quality. So we found that unfenced farm dams had on average 32% more nitrogen in the water. So fencing farm dams on average reduces by around a third the amount of nitrogen loading. Similarly, it also fencing farm dams reduces by around 40% phosphorus loading in the water. And at the same time, we also found a 22% increase in fenced farm dams of dissolved oxygen in the water. But the most astounding result of this research program is that we found a 56% drop in methane emission in fenced farm dams compared to unfenced farm dams. And this was a lot more than what we expected, honestly. And we just published this research in a scientific journal called the Global Change Biology. And this is the summary of our finding. So we found that by the arrow on the right shows that excluding livestock, where it causes an increase in vegetation, and this vegetation acts a bit like a biofilter to clean the water and improves water quality and retains some of the particles to fall inside the water. And this higher water quality has a cascading effects that leads to lower methane emissions. And these cascading effects implies less nutrients, as I was saying, as well as higher dissolved oxygen. That means that and these conditions prevents methane to form to begin with. But there is even more to this story. So before this, there is this idea that farm dams are inevitably contributing to climate change. Except this result here that we found on the y-axis shows the total carbon footprint of a farm dam, and on the x-axis show the dissolved oxygen. And what we found is this quite tight relationship between dissolved oxygen and carbon footprint. Especially, we found a point around 10%, 10 milligrams per liter of dissolved oxygen, where there is a switch, where the carbon footprint becomes from positive, meaning farm dams emit carbon emissions, to negative, meaning that farm dams starts to absorb carbon. So it's like saying that in general, farm dams, more often than not, are like chimneys constantly releasing methane and other greenhouse gas emissions. But this graph shows that there is a possibility where management can switch the flow and turn farm dams from chimneys to vacuum cleaners. And so farm dams, this result shows for the first time that farm dams can be part of the solution when it comes to climate change, and it just comes down to management. So these results were quite important, and we have several other ongoing projects to extrapolate what these results mean on an international scale. And these are preliminary results, but they show that if you add all farm dams together worldwide, their carbon footprint, their current carbon footprint, will be approximately the same as freshwater aquaculture or rivers, and slightly less than reservoirs. This is quite important because among these categories, agricultural ponds are pretty much the only ones that are not included in national greenhouse gas inventories. So the fact that they have similar footprint is surprising, because it says that we should look more into agricultural ponds, because at the moment this is a missing puzzle when we report our greenhouse gas emissions for IPCC reporting under Paris Agreement. And this also shows a similar thing here. We are zooming into Australia. The left panel, hang on, sorry. Okay, there we go. Here we are zooming in on Australia, and the left panel is our modeling of predicted emissions from farm dams across Australia. We're talking about a total of 70 kilotons of methane per year. Forgot to, sorry, there was a glitch in my slides. I should go back to the, okay. So apologies. So the right-hand side shows what it means, this value of farm dams against the total reported greenhouse gas emissions from Australia. And the right panel is a bit complicated. Probably we don't have to deal too much into it, but any kind of square you see on the right-hand side of my slide are reported emissions. The yellow box are the farm dam emissions that are not reported. And so it's like a missing part of the story. And if you include for farm dams, we would expect that our reported emissions from wetlands, freshwater wetlands, would nearly double. And here is here's the same thing with America as case study. Same story. Farm dams are completely ignored when reporting to under Paris Agreement, and if you do include farm dams, the estimated methane emissions would increase by 39%. That's our estimates. Okay, so again, more about the scope of the opportunity, because see, farm dams, our research shows that farm dams emit methane, but also that with management, you can avoid a lot of these methane emissions. So here comes the opportunity, because in Australia, through the Emission Reduction Fund, there are ways for which anyone, farmers, companies, and private individuals can apply to be rewarded for any activities that would reduce their carbon footprint. And so our kind of next step in this research is to then engage with the Clean Energy Regulator and propose a method so that farm dams can be eligible for carbon credits. So these are some of our calculations, are a bit rough estimates, and we are improving on those. We show, after we do all the math, we estimate that you could be rewarded with around between 2 and 4 grants for managing, for like improving the condition of a farm dams just for the carbon emission storage. Just the fact that a managed farm dam, so fencing a farm dam, reduces methane emissions, means that you might be eligible to have compensation. And this, of course, also importantly, as farmers would know, fencing a farm dam has all sorts of co-benefits that is unrelated to carbon, such as biodiversity, less evaporation, water quality, and livestock health. So then what we think is that the carbon credits could help to then help farmers to take actions and get all of these benefits. So a year ago or so, we packaged this research and we submitted to the Clean Energy Regulator, and we proposed a new method for farm dam management. And we had several partners. The method has been reviewed. We received feedback, and we have now monthly meetings with the Clean Energy Regulator to improve on our science and our submission. And we hope that well, we don't know when, but it seems like there is appetite for a farm dam methodology. We just need to keep improving our science until we sort out all the logistical issues. And hopefully this will happen within like a year or so. So these are the feedback we received on what we need to improve in order for a methodology to exist. First one is we need more science. So that's why Deakin invested nearly $50,000 on developing new technology to monitor greenhouse gas emissions automatically from farm dams and send data through a mobile network. So then with this new technology that is relatively low cost, we are hoping to then scattered sensors at a much larger spatial scales and start to then understand the more fine details and at a higher mechanistic resolution what happens to emissions in farm dams. The second part of what we are planning to do is to start to measure demand for a farm dam method. We want to talk to farmers and try to understand the appetite for investing in farm dam management and see how carbon credits could potentially help the decision of a farmer for the farmer to work on their farm dam, or anyway, like the idea of what is the value of a farm dam for a farmer? Is it just the water? Is it the biodiversity, the carbon security? What is it? So we want to take more information on this, the general picture of what a farm dam is. And with that, then we want to go back and try to keep working with the Clean Energy Regulator to organize financial rewards, which I think is likely to happen in a year or two. Okay, right. So this is everything I said is about carbon footprint. Now we can talk a bit on biodiversity. So we have a program called Frogs in Dams, and this program is in collaboration with the Australian Museum and Melbourne Water, and it relies on collecting data from citizen science programs, the Frog ID and Frog Census app. These programs so these programs are like mobile phone apps where anyone can record sounds and send them over. And from the sound, we have experts that can decipher which frog species was detected in the recording across Australia. And being frogs are hard to find visually, working on sounds is generally a good idea. And these data sets combined have resulted in millions of observations across Australia. So our program consisted in overlapping the distribution of frog calls on the distribution of farm dams and filter all of the frogs that were detected nearby a farm dam, and then try to understand what are the properties of a farm dam that would increase the likelihood of having a good biodiversity of frogs detected in a frog call. These are the two frog apps that we used, Frog ID from Australian Museum that covers most of Australia, and then Frog Census, that is a program run by Melbourne Water that covers mostly Victoria. Together, then we detected 104,000 frog calls near farm dams. This is within 50-meter radius from a farm dam. And the number of species per audio recording ranged between 1 to even 8. And now it was a matter of trying to sort out the features of a farm dam that would increase the likelihood of having around 8 species compared to instead just 1. And the first one was the size of a farm dam. That was an important feature. Interestingly, we found that small farm dams tend to have higher number of species compared to large farm dams. Okay, so in this graph, I should mention, the y-axis here is the number of frog species per audio recording. And on the x-axis is the parameter of interest, so in this case is farm dam size. And as you can see, we found a negative relationship. It means that if you have a small farm dam, you have slightly higher number of species compared to large farm dams. Of course, there is a lot of variability in this data set because we're dealing with hundreds of thousands of farm dams, each one at different conditions. So of course here is just a higher order analysis where we ignore everything else and we just look on average what happens if you just look at size. The second parameter of interest was the age of a farm dam. And we found that, well, as you would expect, older farm dams have slightly higher probability of having a higher number of frog species compared to newly established farm dams. Another interesting one is about connectivity. So we compared farm dams that are isolated against farm dams that are instead closely connected or like located nearby and form like a network of farm dams that could promote connectivity. And we found that well-connected farm dams on average host higher number of species, higher biodiversity compared to isolated farm dams. And then something kind of surprising is that there was not much of an effect of nearby density of roads on frog community, frog biodiversity in farm dams. So it seems like it didn't really matter if if the farm dam was close to the road or not. We thought that roads could mean a barrier for connectivity, but it turns out that frogs could potentially cross the road. Right, so this is the summary of all of our findings on the effects of size, age, connectivity, and road density on the biodiversity value of farm dams. A little bit more details on the model, which parameter had more an importance than others. Farm dam area was the most important one, followed by the connectivity and the density of native habitats. Right, so based on these models, we also organized, we also projected what are the areas of high biodiversity in farm dams. This is still work in progress, but it turns out that around ACT, there is higher biodiversity value in farm dams compared to, for example, Western Victoria or Western Australia. We're still investigating on the mechanisms, so this is still work in progress. Okay, and then finally, water security. This is the last research theme of our farm dam work. So this is a research in collaboration with CSIRO and again the Western Australia Department of Primary Industries. This content is a little bit technical, so I'm gonna just give a quick summary of what we found. And so the idea here is that we wanted to try to estimate what is the likely effect of climate change on the reliability of farm dams as a water source. So the idea that in 2050 it's going to be more likely to have empty, like farm dams with less water compared to today or even in the past. So this was a large model that we developed where we selected 100,000 farm dams across Australia. And then for each farm dam, we sourced a time series of temperature and rain. And so like we captured their environmental conditions. And then we put everything into a large model to make sense of the role of temperature and rain on water fluctuations in farm dams. And then we quantify the risk of having an empty farm dams at each condition of temperature and rain. And finally, we then used likely average conditions of temperature and rain for the past, the present, and even the future to understand what are trends in water security. And so how the risk of empty farm dams changes with time. And again, we projected the risk of the change in risk in empty farm dams from today to 2050. And the surprising finding is that, well, 91% of farm dams we selected had an increased risk of having greater frequency of becoming empty. The general idea is that it's very likely that you're going to have a higher frequency of unreliable water in farm dams, or you can rely less on the water in farm dams. Yeah, and that's exactly the title of our study. Okay, right. So I will then quickly mention, I'm not sure how long I talked to, but I think it took for around 40 minutes. So I'll talk quickly about other carbon-related opportunities that are not in farmlands. And so this is about another program that is starting soon related to natural wetlands. And so natural wetlands are really interesting because this is an image of a typical Australian natural wetland. What you see there are red gums, and there's a lot of biodiversity, and they generally act as a carbon sink, meaning that the frequency of regular flooding means there is a lot of carbon, organic carbon, that is trapped inside these ecosystems, in the same way that blue carbon ecosystems like mangroves do the same thing in marine environments. The challenge here is that many of these natural freshwater systems are becoming drier, and that is because of climate change, but most importantly is because of agriculture, channeling water and creating levees and canals that divert water into, well, mostly for agricultural use. And so because of these canals, it is less likely for a natural wetland to flood, meaning that it will be many years before they can see any flooding until there is a particularly large rainfall event. And so natural wetlands start to look a bit like this. And so even red gums cannot keep up with the low frequency of flooding, and so start to die out. And there are also some implications for losing natural wetlands, for biodiversity, for carbon cycling, and even water security. And so we're still looking at what happens in Australia, and our program is looking at rehabilitating some of these old wetlands and understand how we can find management regimes so that we can have agricultural water use coexisting with natural wetlands. So the idea is to then start with something that looks like an old wetland that has not been flooded for many years, and then artificially bringing it back to life by re-wetting it, and then monitoring what happens and all the benefits in terms of carbon sequestration, biodiversity, decrease of annual grasses, increase in amphibian native plants, and so on. And this project is funded in collaboration with the Wetland Revival Trust, the Murray-Darling Wetland Working Group, the Arthur Riley Institute, the Jaja Working Wurrung Clans, Aboriginal corporations, and it's funded through our Future Drought Fund. So we just got back from an initial visit, and this is how we look. And we also have a program where we involve traditional owners to act as rangers for our managed sites. And finally, this is another program that we ran on wastewater treatments. And the idea is that, again, phytoremediation is the principle of using plants to clean the water quality in water systems. And we want to use floating wetlands to improve the condition of, in this case, wastewater treatments, growing plants on top of the water. So that's what we are doing, developing our prototypes of floating surfaces, hosting plants. And we are planning to then deploy these floating wetlands in the Western Port Water treatment lagoon and see what is the benefit of in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so I think this is all for me. Thank you very much for listening. I want to thank all my collaborators. I want to thank Deakin University, the Blue Carbon Lab, the Australian Research Council, the Western Australian Department of Primary Industries, the Clean Energy Regulators, the friends and colleagues from Sustainable Farms, Australian University, Clarity Aquatics, Melbourne Water, and Western Pro Water. Ah, there are two missing. I don't know why they don't show up. There we go. Oh, yeah. Also the Wetland Revival Trust and the Jaja Wurrung clans. And with that, I am now happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Martino. It's really great. I guess we'll try and answer some of the questions that people posted when they were registering for this seminar. And then, as I said, if you want to put any further questions in the questions function, and we'll see if we can get through them. If we don't get through them, we might be able to answer them and send them to the emails of you listed when you registered for this webinar. I guess I'll kick off with a question of my own, if that's possible. I was wondering if you had any ideas, Martino, about whether it's possible to tease apart what are the contributors to the increasing oxygen concentration in enhanced farm dams. Is it phytoplankton activity? Is it vascular plant growth? Is it reduced decomposition in the waters? What's sort of the major difference makers in that regard?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Great question. So, as I was saying, any freshwater systems emit some degree of greenhouse gases. This is mostly methane, but it could also be carbon dioxide. And the methane in particular is produced by the decomposition of organic matter. And so this is mostly plants, but it could also be for a farm dam, this could also be manure, or it could also be I guess any source of organic matter, and then in farm dams, methane is boosted by also nutrients in the water, because nutrients will then speed up microbial activities in the water, and it would just enhance the decomposition of organic matter and turn it into methane. Also because at the same time there is a drop in dissolved oxygen. So what happens when you fence a farm dam is that in summary, you create a biofilter to clean up some of the nutrients in the water through, so like a fence will encourage plant growth. The plants will act as a biofilter and clean the water, as well as the plants on the side of a farm dam will then also avoid some of the particles falling, like being flushed in the farm dam. And by doing all this, the main chemical reaction in the water is an increase in dissolved oxygen. And with more dissolved oxygen, then there is less methane being produced.
So, I guess in terms of dam management, how long would it take to reach that sort of magical tipping point that you talked about where it crosses over into a carbon sink?
Correct. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think it's a matter of time. It's more of matter of management intensity. That's, I guess, if you go hard on it, well, the truth is we don't really know. But there are some farm dams that are anyway quite good in terms of water quality, and so a small intervention could already make them turn them into carbon sinks. Other farm dams that for whatever reasons, like we're talking about very complex mechanisms here. So there is no one thing that drives it all. There are like a million factors that we still don't understand, even the type of soil or the type of weather conditions and all that. So it really depends.
We had a group a series of questions together. We had several people interested in turbidity in dams and how to reduce turbidity and what effect that has on the outcomes we're talking about.
So turbidity is a process that depends on physical disturbances most of all. So, for example, if you have livestock accessing the water, then you're pretty much guaranteed to have turbidity. But again, if you then establish a fence and you exclude livestock, turbidity should eventually settle down. And yeah, I mean, of course, after a big rain event, you might have a temporary increase in turbidity. Turbidity could also be due not to particles, but say like algal blooms. If there is a lot of nutrients in the water, you might have episodic algal blooms that reduce visibility. In general, the effect of turbidity is the most immediate one is to reduce light penetration in the water, which indirectly means less primary production in the water from phytoplankton. And this means a reduction in dissolved oxygen. And less dissolved oxygen, as I was saying before, means more methane. So yeah, and I guess fencing would be the first step to reduce turbidity.
Yeah. I think here it's probably worth mentioning for people with dams who are interested in managing them, even after enhancing the dam, at least by fencing, it can take a long time for that turbidity to clear, particularly if it's very fine particulate clay particles or something of that nature. And the turbidity can fluctuate depending on inflows, what's happening outside the area that you've enhanced, whether there's life in the water that's stirring up sediments, things like that. Another question is, what the size of the dam or the degree of permanency of the water make a difference? Assuming that's to carbon emissions. Emissions.
Good question. Well, I mean, the size of a dam, yeah, for sure, because in terms of carbon emission, that's a per area flow. So larger dams on average will emit more than small dams. So there are two processes going on. There is the overall carbon budget of a farm dam will inevitably increase with the size of a farm dam. So if you have a large farm dam and you reduce methane emissions, you're reducing methane emissions per meter square. So depending on how big your farm dam, you can multiply the benefits. Probably the more challenging question is what is the effect of farm dam size on a per meter methane emission flux? So if you have a large farm dam, each meter would emit less or more than a small farm dam. That's a tricky question, and I don't think I can answer just yet. We don't have enough data. Not sure. I guess my gut feeling is that larger farm dams tend to be deeper too, and deeper farm dams they emit slightly less methane because they warm up less fast, and generally with depth you find that methane bubbles decrease. But again, that's something that we still need to look more into.
It sounds a bit counterintuitive to what I would have thought. I would have thought you'd get the stratification in the dam and the lower layers, if it was a deeper dam, would be more anaerobic.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. Except there is another process going on. That is if we want to go more in depth on methane emission from farm dams, there are two different types of fluxes. There is the diffusive flux and the ebullition flux. Ebullitions are the bubbles, the ones that I was showing before, and the bubbles make up most of the carbon budget of a farm dam. And so turns out that methane bubbles don't happen in deep systems, because lakes and reservoirs, for example, the water pressure is so big that these bubbles are trapped at the bottom. They cannot be released. And so instead, in a more shallow environment, a bubble has an easier life to just break through and win the hydrostatic pressure. So yeah, two things going on. It's complex and probably it's not a linear effect. There's probably some kind of a middle depth that will give the maximum amount of bubbles. Again, we need to do more science there.
Sure. Another question is, what is the impact of fertilizer on methane emissions as opposed to just organic matter?
Yeah, so in general, more fertilizer means more microbial activity, which means faster decomposition of organic matter, and also means, on average, higher production of methane. So, and also because fertilizers will tend to decrease dissolved oxygen too, and so both will then act to increase methane. Again, there is a bit more complexity there. If you look at the biochemistry, there are also some pathways where particular type of nutrients, such as nitrate, might actually inhibit methane productions, but again, it gets complicated, but in general, more fertilizers means more methane.
Again, grouping a few questions together, there's a few questions about specific water plant species that are best suited for dams. I think I'd direct people, at least in the southeast of Australia, to the ANU Sustainable Farms and Planting Guide. That's probably the best. But I'd also say that, as your data probably points to, Martino, as the dam ages, water plants tend to turn up by themselves. They get transported in by water birds. Seeds can wash in from further up in the catchment. And as the dam gets older, it tends to accrue water plant species. If you want to accelerate the process, of course, you can introduce things and source water plants from other dams, from old dams, from nearby natural wetlands if you can find them nearby. Let's just go to another question. Does the depth of dam influence methane levels, diversity, water security? I'm assuming that means security, water security.
Yeah. If just because of the cooler temperatures of deeper dams and less evaporation, lots of other things impact water security. We are working on that too. Having like a vegetation shelter from the wind will also decrease the evaporation and improve water security. Yeah, so.
Another question is, how long before a dam is considered old? If a dam is cleaned out, if an old dam is cleaned out, does this impact the biodiversity so that it then becomes a new dam?
Cleaned out
Depends how much.
field?
Yeah, as in the silt is removed by machinery.
Yeah, so again, that's not something that we have looked at the moment because it has massive effects on water chemistry when you remove the silt from a farm dam. I don't. So the principles I was talking about on the age of a farm dam is more about the vegetation surrounding a farm dam and biodiversity like frogs. So the silting, I don't know if that has major impacts. I don't necessarily think so. In terms of the greenhouse gases, I don't know because we haven't quite had the chance to look at this.
I think as we're coming up to 1 o'clock, we'll probably make this the last question. It's just as a follow-on to that one. Are frogs an indication of general biodiversity levels in a dam? Or if there are frogs, well, probably the species, and the frog's kind of the easiest species, class of species to manage, to measure, using those apps particularly.
Yeah. So we used frogs as a proxy for biodiversity because they are convenient species to work with. We have good databases to access. In general, whether higher number of frogs means higher number of any other species or like as a general proxy of biodiversity, I think is a reasonable assumption, but there are some limitations there. For example, higher number of frog species might just means that there are no predators, and so in terms of biodiversity, it means that there is no biodiversity in predators. So I don't know how much you can extrapolate beyond the frogs because there could be more complex mechanisms acting. Yeah.
Right. I think that's all we've got time for. Unfortunately, I'd like to keep going. We unanswered questions, as I said, we might be able to answer them in text and be able to email them out afterwards to try and address some of those questions. Just in closing, again, I'd like to thank Martino for giving the seminar today and also to thank the Future Drought Fund for supporting this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. Thanks everyone for listening and keep in touch. Feel free to write or get in touch. Cheers.